Hello, Tommy Ronan here. This is a quick video just to run through my final assignment for my EY portfolio quickly. So the reason I chose my topic on foundations and reinforced concrete was last week I was actually digging out a foundation and working with reinforced concrete as my uncle was building a new extension to his house. I thought that doing this topic would be very beneficial as I had first-hand information and digging out this foundation myself. So as you can see here from the photos, the two of us digging out the foundation on the top right with a mini digger. The bottom left is the photo of the foundation dug out, and the bottom right is the concrete installed inside the foundation, ready for the concrete to pour. So I'm going to run through this assignment now quickly, an overview. So here I went through the purpose of a foundation and the foundations. I talked about the four most common foundations then found in Ireland. Then I went through picking the foundation. So there's a number of careful considerations that need to be taken into account when picking a foundation type. So the soil, ground movement, and the actual site itself. So we were working with a very tight site as it's in a housing estate in town in Kilkenny. So then there's other key factors. I talked about reinforced concrete. So reinforced concrete is reinforcing the concrete with steel, like we did up in our foundation for the extension. So then my lesson intentions, I went through three lesson intentions and my success criteria. I talked about the psychomotor, the cognitive, and affective. Then my success criteria, I talked about the introduction. I then went through key considerations in a good lesson. I went through that three times and I talked about my three different lesson intentions, and I took the same approach with higher order questions and educated answers that my students must give to me. So this is my second learning intention that I spoke about. I also talked about discussing the method to go with in relation to an experiment, which I will talk about further as we go down through the portfolio. And then finally, my last learning intention here, I talked about. Then my organisation of my learning, went through the intro here. Then I created an open discussion. I used different teaching methods, like dividing them up into groups to use peer teaching and the jigsaw method. Here is the principle on how forces work. So as you push down the force down on concrete, then you have compression on the top side and you have tension on the bottom side, like I clearly showed here in my diagram. The main body of my lesson then is here. I went through it and I talked about a step-by-step approach of my experiment. So here I have a diagram of my experiment and I have 5 steps on how to go through it for the students. Here's more about it. Main body, I talked about the abstract conceptualization and I talked about active experimentation. So this is all about clubs learning structure. Then I was on to my conclusion. Effective teaching and learning activities. So I talked about an intro here. I used a sponge activity where I used the sponge to show the forces of weight pressed on concrete. So I talked about compression and tension, like I showed in the diagram previously. This is a brainstorming diagram here that students may use to brainstorm their work. As I go on further, the experiment I chose to do was I created different lengths of concrete and I placed steel in different positions along my concrete lengths. All my lengths were different sizes so we could test them. I made these prior to the class with the students not to waste time as the concrete needs time to set. So here I talked about the completion of the experiment. Then I went on and reviewed analysis and data. So here is a table I created for myself, and here is another table where the breaking point was for our concrete. So conclusion then, I wrapped up the lesson. I gave the students some homework just to test them, so they had good knowledge on how to complete the homework, so I'd be sure that they'd be able to complete it easily. So then the assessment methods, I mainly used formative assessment. So I talked about the intro. The activity I done in my lesson was using the sponge. So I did an assessment for learning, and then I did assessment as learning. So they're explained here, I have them explained. Then I did my experiment with my concrete lens, and then the ending of my lesson is here. My resources, so I used the sponges with the students, steel, concrete. I used my laptop. I used the projector then to show images to my students and PowerPoints. I used the whiteboard, and obviously the students used graph paper then when graphing the results, and basic classroom materials, which we drawing equipment, rubbers, pencils. Finally then, in relation to my uncle's extension, here on the left hand side is a concrete lorry which mixes up the concrete, and this is a lorry that people might be unfamiliar with. Is a big massive pump that pumps the concrete in over my uncle's house. So my uncle lives in the housing estate in town, so it wasn't sufficient to use wheelbarrows or to get back the lorry in the whole way to pour the concrete. So the picture here on the right is the concrete that we poured, and we screed it and tapped it down to get all the air bubbles out of the concrete.